Welcome, everyone. I am in China with good friend Carlos Martinez, Friends of Socialist China. We are here in Chengdu, China. We're actually in the ancient city. It is beautiful in terms of its older structures, but it's really a shopping center. So we're here in the lively Chengdu. Carlos, let's talk about the states of the world right now. You're from the United Kingdom, or maybe we should say England.
Great Britain, you recognise the legitimacy. United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because we support Irish independence, obviously.
Obviously. And I'm from the United States, and of course our countries are at the center of essentially the biggest and hottest and most destructive wars and conflicts right now, whether it's in West Asia, Gaza, Yemen, what Israel is doing, backed by the United States and the United Kingdom. Ukraine, of course, is an ongoing saga. Of course, the United Kingdom has been at the heart of trying to continue that war. And of course, we have China. We're here in China. And both the US and the UK are at the center of anti-China warmongers. So, Carlos, based on your work and what you're doing and what you're focusing on, what do you have to say? You've been to China several times. What's your takeaways from all of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of the big picture, geopolitics, it's really interesting to think about the contrast between where we're from, the West, and China. It's like the polar opposites. And I think they can kind of present what Rosa Luxemburg was saying a century ago about humanity's choices, the two paths, so more barbarism. And that's what we got today in the 21st century at a global scale. We can follow China's path, or the global community's shared future, trying to bring about kind of peaceful development, sustainable development, big focus on renewable energy, big focus on biodiversity, sustainability, big focus on peaceful resolution of conflicts, commitment at a constitutional level to peace, you can see that in China's efforts to bring about reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You can see that in terms of Chinese mediating reconciliation of the 14 Palestinian factions and the Napoleon Declaration. You can see that in terms of China's efforts with Brazil, with the African Union, try and mediate negotiated peace in Ukraine. And then you contrast that with what the US met allies are doing, which is creating misery and war and inequality and poverty around the world, and pursuing all in pursuit of this project for you American Central, which is going nowhere. Everybody knows can't work, but our ruling classes insist on this kind of last-ditch attempt to project their dominance, hegemony of the 20th century into the 21st century, and they're pretty happy to essentially lord out their words, take all of humanity out, rather than accept this trajectory towards multipolarity and peace and sovereignty and sustainability, and different nations finding their own path to development, finding their own path to the future. So yes, it's wonderful as always to be in China. It's my sixth trip with What's Up New.
Five. Yeah, I think you went one more time. Yeah. I mean, this is a really interesting place, actually, where we are in Chengdu. Of course, Chengdu, just like all Chinese cities, are very modern, but a big push for China right now is the civilizational state, as Zhang Weiwei says, but a huge emphasis on history and tradition through the modernization process. And this is a big part of it. So you see, I'll just do a quick circle around, the Hotongs, the old structures, and a Dairy Queen right behind us. But it's quite lively here. Lots of people in the middle of the week, just enjoying life. And I often say, whenever I'm in China, domestic life here often is a huge reflection of the overall system that China projects both here but abroad too. I mean, China's foreign policy, I know you're seriously thinking about a new book on China's foreign policy and its comparisons. The world right now, you can even see and I was joking with you earlier, the South China Morning Post, not always known to be a so-called pro-China outlet based in Hong Kong, at this time, it is really difficult to say negative things about China because China has made essentially all the right moves in response to U.S. economic aggression and its approach to conflicts like Ukraine and what's happening in West Asia is just so fundamentally different from the United States.
I mean, I think you can see that even among young people in the West, like in London, my son's 16 years old. Him and all his friendship group had seen like the TikTok video of Victor Gao going viral, like China's been around for 5,000 years. Or most of that time, America didn't exist and we were fine, etc., etc. We're going to fight back against the tariffs, so we'll be whatever it takes. And this has got massive and a popular support, this idea. But China has got the right to fight back against American hegemonism. And that's combined with a period of time in which I think people have lost so much confidence in the mainstream narrative, like imperialist baseball hegemony is breaking down to such an extent, particularly as a result of the fact that our government are literally supporting and sponsoring, financing, arming, and giving diplomatic cover for a genocide. Everyone knows that. Everyone can see that. We can see on our mobile phones a genocide going on, but then our governments are telling us, and our media is telling us, that there isn't a genocide going on. So that the cognitive dissonance of that produces means that we just completely lost faith in that mainstream narrative. And you contrast that with Xinjiang, where our governments have been telling us, and our media have been telling us, that there is a genocide going on, and they can produce absolutely no evidence in support of that claim whatsoever. I think it's, people are starting to see through the narratives, and the fact that they can see through what's going on in Gaza means that they're questioning the narrative in relation to Ukraine, they're questioning the narrative in relation to China. Meanwhile, China's doing all this positive stuff in terms of foreign policy that we earlier. Furthermore, indisputably, the world's only renewable energy superpower, like a lot of young people in particular, are very focused on environmental issues, and they can see that when it comes to renewable energy, electric vehicles, electric transport in general, hydrogen development, biodiversity protection, forestation, China's well out in front. Like, there's not even a question. Like, China's responsible for 50% of all renewable energy production in the world. And because of their innovation and because of their economy of scale, they brought the global prices down by like 70, 80%. So yeah, if you're in Africa, if you're in, let's say, Mali, and you want a new power station, it's more cost effective for you to choose solar than it is for you to choose oil or gas. And that's almost exclusively the result of Chinese investment and innovation in that period. So they've been doing this massive, producing global public goods for humanity. And people can see that. There's no hiding that. So all this kind of anti-China narrative is so much less effective than it used to be.
It's interesting because there are many people who might watch this video, detractors who would say, oh, well, you're just an agent of the CCP, quote unquote, and you're just glossing over all the negatives. And there are many people actually who might watch this and say, well, China actually isn't doing very much at all in the areas, especially in the global scale, on the global stage, where, of course, many viewers here are concerned about the future of West Asia, the future of Palestine, as well as the future of Europe, and vis-a-vis Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which many were concerned was going to spiral into World War III. And many say China hasn't done enough. China isn't doing enough. What do you say to this? Because it's so interesting when we see how the global balance of forces in the world, the relationships that are evolving worldwide. I see much of the world, at least much of the world that matters now, this big shift away from the West, this big shift toward the global majority. It seems to center so much on China. What's your take on those detractors who see China as not as assertive as it needs to be?
Look, it's kind of like not for me or anyone else outside of China to determine China's foreign policy for it. Is China doing enough around Gaza? Like, would I be super glad and happy to support it if the People's Liberation Army Navy blockaded Israel? Sure. 100%. But the point of China foreign policy is that they adhere very rigidly to international law, to the United Nations, to the principles of peaceful coexistence. And that means that they won't arbitrarily impose sanctions. Like, they haven't imposed sanctions on Israel. And a lot of people on the left can, quite justifiably say, well, why doesn't China sanction Israel? There is a genocide there. And China's position is, well, we will only participate in sanctions if they're legal, if they're approved under international law, they've been ratified by the UN Security Council. And the reason that China not that position is that it's then got justification for not imposing sanctions, say, on Russia, right? The US, Canada, Japan, the European Union, Australia have all imposed unilateral sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions are actually illegal because no sanction isn't either a kind of a response or retaliation or isn't approved by the Security Council, isn't legal. So China says, well, we stick to international law, therefore we're not going to sanction Russia. And the fact that China hasn't sanctioned Russia has obviously been economically a lifeline to Russia at a time when it's been cut out of like the whole international financial system based on the dollar. And China sees that a future multipolar world is going to be based around the principles of the UN Charter.
Yeah, and maybe we can just turn around because we're actually heading out of the exit here. But and it's a mob. I mean, it's just absolutely mobs here today. This is the middle of the week. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon where we are, and it is very busy here. So, well, I wanted to actually your response to this, given what you just said, as we've had conversations about China's foreign policy, and when it comes to these detractors who say China isn't doing enough, I think they don't understand the two very important sides to this question. On the one hand, you have China facing down its own threats of war from the United States and, of course, the West at large, which has been waging a hybrid war, which has a huge military component, which is really building and paving the way toward a catastrophic conflict, especially from the United States' side in the South China Sea, also, of course, Taiwan, Philippines. We can go across the board. It's incredibly dangerous, and China is facing that down. Economic warfare, diplomatic, and other kinds of pressures politically on the world stage that China has to face down. Plus, China is still a developing country that, first and foremost, is going to put the well-being and benefit of the Chinese people and the continued growth and development of the society, of course, over the interests of the world. But China also doesn't see it as an either-or kind of thing. It sees it as deeply connected. And I would argue that China's foreign policy, while not aggressive in the sense that it's going to essentially directly intervene and fund, for example, Palestinian resistance or give, as the United States and NATO and Ukraine has been saying this whole time, give direct military support to Russia, but through its economic relationships and through its Belt and Road Initiative and various other projects to achieve, as you said, a community with a shared future with its trading partners, I believe that actually builds the blocks toward genuine peace and also the empowerments of the very people that we're talking about. China is committed to the Palestinian question. It wants to see the liberation of Palestine, but it certainly cannot control what the United States does. And if people think that China can just simply cut off its ties with the United States or even Israel without significant consequences, I think that underestimates just how irrational and how rapidly warmongering the United States and the collectivists can be. So I think it can be kind of a reductionist argument to say that China isn't doing enough, but I want to know your thoughts.
I mean, essentially, my thought is that I completely agree. China's rise over the period of reform and opening up has been entirely predicated on the one hand, peaceful development, and on the other hand, integration into the global economic system. And those things are very much related to each other. But peace has been foundational for China's development. And it speaks volumes, and we talked about it many times, the fact that China hasn't been to war in over 4 decades, in a period where the United States and its allies have been literally constantly at war, be it in Vietnam, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, Russia, Ukraine. So China's used this period, several decades of peace, in order to really focus its efforts on its economic development and to become a science and technology superpower, to become a renewable energy superpower, and to really, it's established itself at the core of what is now a very viable multipolar politics, with BRICS at its center, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, with ASEAN, with which China has excellent relations, with GELAT, with which China has excellent relations, with the African Union, with which China has excellent relations, and even, with the European Union, with which China is the EU's major trading partner. So China is kind of like putting its money where its mouth is in terms of a multipolar future, and that's relied on, as I say, peace, a context of peace, and it's relied on playing nice with the global economic order, with global capitalism. Essentially, China is a member of the World Trade Organization, which is very controversial for people on the left, but China benefited massively from its incorporation in the WTO. The simple fact is that Chinese people live almost unimaginably better than they lived 40, 50 years ago. And yes, there's much more inequality in China now, and there's lots of private capital, and there's exploitation of labor, and there's rhymes like KFC and McDonald's, and we probably passed a Starbucks while we've been walking. But even as inequality has grown, the level at the bottom of society has considerably increased, to the point where if you're poor in China, you're not only are you better, much better off than poor people in elsewhere in India, where my family is from. To be poor means to be in intergenerational debt bondage, or to be living in a peri-urban slum, and your kids don't go to school, and you can't read and write. So China doesn't have anything like that. But increasingly, we're at a point where to be poor in China is to be in a much better situation than poor people in London or New York or so China's grown far stronger economically and politically and diplomatically, and it really benefits from its win-win model, not just with the countries of the global south, but with the countries of the global north as well. No, there's absolutely no doubt that China and Chinese people have benefited from their interaction with the United States, and there's no doubt that the Americans have benefited as well, right?
Yeah.
You're saying that the same is the case with Europe. So the US, the ruling circles in the West and in the US in particular, see China's rise, and they see its trajectory, and they kind of do come belatedly to the realization that that's not going to stop, and that China's not going to accept a pan situation of being subjugated at the bottom of the global economic ladder, producing T-shirts and cheap toys for Americans and Europeans, and that China's plan has always been to go up the value chain to improve the living conditions of its people, and on a global stage, promote multipolarity and create a situation whereby the countries of the world can exercise their sovereignty and choose their own path to progress. So we're at that point now where the West actively wants to disrupt China's rise, and it sees that integration into the world order has been a big part of China's rise, and it sees that peace has been a big part of China's rise, and therefore the US and the Western countries want to disrupt both of those things. They want to ensure that China is decoupled from the global economy, and that China doesn't know peace for much longer. And there's nothing they would love more than to basically draw China into a war, almost certainly over Taiwan or the South China Sea.
Yep.
And that's why we've got this, deepening militarization. And in South China, that's why you've got 300 military bases in the Pacific. That's why you've got the THAAD missile system deployed in South Korea and Guam. That's why you've got 4 or 5 new military bases in the Philippines.
Yeah.
You've got a new military base, US military base in Darwin in North Australia. you've got literally hundreds of thousands of troops and weapons, including nuclear weapon systems, deployed, in Japan, in Okinawa, in Guam, in South Korea, in Australia, all aimed at this overall project of China containment, China encirclement, and preparing for the situation of turning a Cold War into a hot war. So that's the very kind of dangerous regional and global situation that China's facing. And for that reason, it has to play the game extremely carefully, as I've been alluding to.
Yeah, we know that the United States, it's overall, we're going to see very soon. I don't know when this video will be seen by viewers, but either Eldridge Colby's national security strategy will have been released or it's not yet out. But regardless, it's being worked on. And we know that the Trump administration is going to prioritize China. Someone like Eldridge Colby as your undersecretary of defense is just a clear sign. This is a China hawk, a warmonger. And all of this that you stated is this trajectory, this plan, this policy to essentially try to contain and destroy China's rise and turn it back into what it was during the century of humiliation, a weak and subservient, divided country. That is very bad for Palestine. It's very bad for the multipolar world. It's very bad for Russia, Ukraine. So people who care about questions of geopolitics and world development need to understand that this is all connected. China's biggest partner in West Asia is Iran. The attempt to destroy Iran is really also about the road to overthrowing and dismembering China's political and economic process. There is just no disconnecting any of this. And you said it earlier, for those who have a problem with China's approach to Palestine, we all want to see everybody as assertive as possible and doing everything they can to stop the horrific and gruesome genocidal condition that Palestinian people find themselves in due to U.S. and Israeli aggression. We all want to see that. But it's important to understand that what China is able to do under very, 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 I don't even want to use the word complex, dangerous global conditions has made a big difference. It has made it that actually China has led the way diplomatically. China has led the way regarding taking a very firm stance for armed resistance at the United Nations. These are all very big things. And the truth is how I see it, and your final comments on this, because we hail from the UK in the US or England in the US, and we live in the heart of the empire of the real problem, the root of the problem, what Putin says, the root causes of all of the geopolitical, economic, and global crises that the world faces. And I often believe that these, what I think are just misguided criticisms are really a way to deflect from the real problem and the root causes of all of this. So your final thoughts on this, as we just exited the incredibly busy shopping center of the ancient city, and now we are in a beautiful park.
If you know what the tomb is.
We don't know. Actually, our guide said that there is probably a temple around here. It's in the same place, so he might have actually been here right before us. But yeah, your final thoughts as we head out.
Yeah, I think that's right. Capitalist ruling classes in times of crisis are always going to find scapegoats. And historically, that's where racism comes from. And that's where racism turns violent and turns into fascism. And that's where Cold War and McCarthyism comes from, the Red Scare, Reds under the bed, etc. This association of any kind of progressive sentiment in the United States and in the West in general with, red Russian communists. And we're going to see, we've already started to see that. There's already a new Reds under the bed moment in relation to China and the Communist Party of China, especially in the United States. There's a new McCarthyism to go along with a new Cold War. And so China's going to be a new scapegoat for everything that goes wrong. You can also see it in countries in the global south that have got some beef with China or that are under a certain amount of influence from the United States. So, for example, in India, there's a lot of scapegoating of China as well. But, as I say, people in India could be living in multi-generational debt bondage or not have food on the table, or their kids don't go to school
despite that massive economic growth that we always hear about.
Yeah. And they can be fooled into thinking that China's got something to do with those problems. And so this all feeds into the new Cold War, and it's a propaganda war, which is ultimately war propaganda. It's about buying public support for anti-China aggression. And it's really important that people are vigilant about that and are open to understanding it and actually work to build understanding of China and to build people-to-people friendship with China. And, like people, as I said, people who care about the environment, you need to be taking your lead from China. This is where it's happening. People who care about equality and sovereignty and fairness and justice in international international relations, look to China. China's leading the way on this stuff. The things that people care about, poverty alleviation, there's literally no country in history that's done as much as China has when it comes to poverty alleviation. Like that, that's not just us saying that, that's the United Nations saying that, right? What China has done in terms of eradicating extreme poverty is unprecedented anywhere in the world ever. So, we need to understand that, and we need to make sure that we're not operating on the same side as our ruling classes, that we recognize that China's not our enemy. It's our ruling classes. It's the imperialists that are our enemy. We share the same enemy as the Chinese people. And, we went to Chongqing yesterday. We went to some really interesting memorials and some museums, specifically about prison massacres that were perpetrated by the Kuomintang in the mid-1940s, late 1940s, just before the liberation of China. So 1947, 1948, by the Kuomintang, working in alliance with and on the intelligence of the United States. And it was really interesting because we were the only foreigners that were at these memorials. And there were, probably 10 different school groups, like hundreds and hundreds of children, and pensioner groups as well.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see how connected even these young people, down to ages 7 or 8, I guess, how connected they are to their history and the extent to which they recognize and appreciate the sacrifices that were made by that generation, the generation that brought liberation to China. They still feel that, and they know that they live well today. And the reason they live well today is because people, generations made sacrifices, their forefathers made sacrifices. Then, they're not going to be fooled by imperialist propaganda. They're not going to go for CIA, USAID nonsense. They're going to be supporting their government. And you can see that in this recent tariff war, right? Like the whole country has just come down in support of their own government, in support of their own economy, in support of their own companies. They're like, okay, you're going to put tariffs on us. We're going to basically have an informal boycott on US brands, and we're just going to support our local brands because we support our country over everything, right? So they're connected to that history. We shouldn't, they're not going to be fooled by the US and the British ruling classes, and neither should we. Let's open our eyes. Let's integrate ourselves into the global working class, into the global anti-imperialist movement for a multipolar future of independence, sovereignty, and fairness, and prosperity, and sustainability.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think this is a great place to close. I'm with Carlos here in Chengdu, in the beautiful ancient city here. Follow him, Friends of Socialist China. Follow that website. I'll have it in the video description of this video. And yeah, I think everything you said, Carlos, really does speak to, and we'll have to do this in another video. It does speak to what I believe is really a decline in our orbit of the world, in the United States, the United Kingdom / England in the West, and China's rise, and really the rise of multipolarity, all these points that we hit on, even despite the awful suffering that we see in West Asia and even, in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, despite all the suffering, the sanctions, the horrific cruelty and violence that this empire is imposing, I think we are seeing the world break out of it in its own way. And that's something we should be supporting and really emphasizing, to stay away from what I believe is just unuseful pessimism and just cynicism, which doesn't lead to anything except for backing for the embraces of this collapsing empire. But Carlos, we'll talk again soon.